And so yeah, so the agenda is, starting now, it's kind of free flowing, and Dr. Rencher has promised us some question answer sessions, so you can feel free to ask our questions and get answers. So we don't have to wait until the end for a Q&A session, I guess. And so feel free to ask questions in the middle. Now I'm gonna try my level best to bring everybody in, but I only have one extra screen, so I can only see so many faces over here. So if I don't reach out to you, feel free to post something on just general chat, and I'll try to bring you in when I can. And just as a courtesy, raise your hand or say something, and then keep yourself muted generally. And when you have, when I ask you to ask a question, feel free to unmute and speak out. So let me just very briefly introduce Dr. Rencher. She has told me that she's going to tell you more about herself when she gives the talk herself. So, but it's kind of just, for starters, let me just say what I have to say. So Dr. Rencher currently serves as the director of tech-based programs at TechTown Detroit. She has an MBA from the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan and a PhD in Business and Organizational Anthropology from Wayne State University, where she was actually telling us earlier, just before the session started, that this is, and I didn't know this, the Business and Organizational Anthropology was something that got started at Wayne State, which is very, very impressive to me. Right. And okay, and she's definitely a frequent speaker on tech and entrepreneurship and inclusion. She has been a presenter at TEDx Detroit, Princeton University, and SXSW. She is the co-author of a forthcoming book, Hard Reset, Framing Inclusion as the New Normal. And she's going to talk to us today about radical inclusion in tech. So Dr. Rencher, welcome.
Thank you very much, Pooja. And Paul, I appreciate the clap, especially in this virtual space. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about radical inclusion in tech. Like a good anthropologist, though, I'm going to give you a little bit of my context so you can see kind of where I'm coming from with this. I think that radical inclusion in tech is an extremely relevant thing to talk about right now, especially given kind of where we are as a society, some of the things that we're talking about, generally speaking. And so it's important for me to let you know where I'm situated in that. So as Bujo mentioned, I went to University of, or actually I went to Wayne State University and got my PhD in Business and Organizational Anthropology. But before that, I got my MBA from the University of Michigan. And before that, I got my bachelor's in marketing from Michigan State University. And before that, I was a kid in the city of Detroit. And I've gotten to speak at a few different places, but that being a kid thing has really, really informed a lot of my activity. And so right now, I work at TechTown Detroit, helping lead the technology entrepreneurship-based programming there. I also started something called Tech Founders Academy, which helps Black and Brown women reinvent themselves as tech founders. I am working with a colleague of mine on a book, and also do a selective consultation on diversity, inclusion, and equity issues. And it's called Hard Reset. And of course, something I really am passionate about is I'm a co-founder of an angel investment group. For those of you who don't know, angel investors are usually people who are provide financial capital to small businesses, usually very, very early. We bet on those businesses before anybody else does. And typically it's the difference between that business, becoming successful and not. And as passionate as I am about business, I really recognize that angels kind of stand in the gap. But let me talk a little bit more about that passion. So I think that it's important to have in any conversation, a conversation about why it is you're speaking. And so why I'm speaking today is pretty simple. Like I said, I'm a kid from Detroit. And when I was growing up in Detroit, a lot of strip malls looked exactly like this, strips in the neighborhood strips look exactly like this strip right here. And you probably could see a strip like this today. But in growing up and seeing this, and then also kind of going to my cousins in Chicago and seeing that they had strips like this. I mean, middle-class neighborhood strips like this, but in their neighborhoods, a lot of times those strips had businesses in them, like not much more upscale, but they actually had businesses in those spaces and we didn't. And it always occurred to me as a missing, like something was wrong here, something was missing here. And so I recognized that that impact in my childhood, impact in my neighborhood was around businesses and entrepreneurship. And this was something that was really, really important. And like I said, I grew up, I didn't say the 80s, but that's, late 70s, early 80s when I grew up. And so I had this stuff. I don't know if any of you recognize what this stuff is, but this is Nintendo Switch, like a long, long, long time ago. Those are Pongs. That my mother and father are teachers. They loved having us have computers. We had a Commodore 64. We had the Atari 2600. My cousins had a 5200, so we went and visited them. So we had all this computer stuff, and took computer classes. And so my parents were really convinced that technology was like the next big thing. And it was something that grew a love for me for computers and for technology. But when I looked at computers and I saw all these cool stories about computers, none of the people who were the heroes of these stories looked like me. Like there's, Bill Gates and there's Sean Fanning and Zuckerberg and Jobs and Andreessen and, Larry from Oracle. All these folks had, these backgrounds around technology, but I could not see myself in them. And so it really got to me as something that was out of place. And it's certainly something that informs the way that I live my life and the things that I do for my job. So one of the things that I wrestle with is that the fact is, statistically speaking, Black women drive a lot of the entrepreneurial growth that's out there. In terms of this period of 2007 through 2018, there was 12% growth for all businesses. Obviously, there was a lot of challenge during that time. Women had 58% growth and Black women had 164% growth. And so there's all this growth that's happening. But what we found is that, what you find if you look at the numbers is that growth is around, businesses that aren't scaling, businesses that don't have employees, businesses that aren't generating the kind of revenue that could be generated. And another thing that I found is that there's a lot of this concentration of business that, is not producing the kind of explosive growth that if there was more of a tap into scalable models could really make a difference. And in fact, there's research that suggests that if these businesses were being funded and also were scaling at the same rate that other businesses were, then we could have full employment for all the people who look like me in my community. And so if you think back to that strip mall, can you imagine then what kind of change, what kind of impact that would be? So as little girls walking, to the store, walking to the school, you see yourself, you see your success actually in your neighborhood, not something that's kind of divorced from you or from your experience. And so that's something that really impacts me and really kind of informs the way that I do my job. And my specific and personal goal is to help uplift enough women so that there are 5 women that I've touched, influenced, helped hopefully invested in, that become Black women specifically, that become in unicorns by the year 2030. So for those of you who don't know, a unicorn is a company that is valued at being $1 billion or more in terms of their value. So, you know, you talk about the Facebooks and all that, they're like ultra unicorns, but there are a lot of companies out there that have created that kind of value. And it's my specific mission to work with that. And one of the things that I'm really proud of is we're just starting a program. I mean, like, when I say just, I'm saying like right now. I'm doing the RFP and we're doing the recruitment in the next 7 to 9 days, where we're recruiting 50 Black women in the city of Detroit to become tech founders. So these can be women who already have a business that maybe is not as technologically enabled, or people who have a strong idea, and we'll take them through the process. And it's connected with is funded by the National Science Foundation, the EAGER grant, and it's connected to the I-Corps program, which is really kind of customer discovery focus that is in this Midwest area. So really, really proud about that. And it's our hope that through executing this program in conjunction with Wayne State University and a couple of other partners, that at least I can get 1 or 2 unicorns out of that whole process. That would be really, really great. But let's talk about radical inclusion in tech. And so, you know, with that context, one of the things that I came to TechTown with, so when I first started at TechTown, I was the first managing director there. But more recently, I started at TechTown as the diversity and inclusion entrepreneur in residence. So what that meant was, you know, TechTown itself as an organization perceives or positions inclusion as being its particular competitive advantage. So there's a accelerator that's a global accelerator called TechStars. And TechStars had a platform or a program that was running in the city of Detroit that was specific around getting entrepreneurs who were doing mobility and mobility-related startups. And actually over the last couple of years, that TechStars office here had to close down. Now they brought a lot of startups in through the space, but those startups didn't really reflect the community that they were in. And so over time, and one of the things actually I've had a front row seat of being able to look at is your opportunity around technology, around innovation is always going to come from inclusion, at least right now, in spaces that, you know, narrowly focus on one specific group. You're leaving, you know, 90% of your potential off of the table. And so for TechTown, my role was to make sure that as much as possible, we were and we are making sure that when you see those tech heroes, when you think about those tech startups, you could see yourself in that role. And that's one of the things that I'm really, really proud of. And so let me tell you about this research that informs that pride. And so when I first came as diversity and inclusion entrepreneur in residence, one of the things that I was intellectually curious about was I wanted to find out, you know, I knew, and probably many of you have heard this idea that the field of technology is not very diverse. And when it comes to entrepreneurship, then that certainly is the case as well. And so you could go in and just kind of say, hey, it's not diverse, and we can kind of slice up, and I gave you some stats, and we can, you know, kind of talk about all of that. But what I was focused on is, okay, where are the spaces where there was diversity, where people were doing inclusion and doing inclusion well? And so during that time, what I did was I traveled across the country. I went to Atlanta, I went to Miami, I went to South by Southwest in Austin. I went to, all these different spaces and looked at the places inside those places where inclusion was done well. And the spaces that I identified included co-working spaces. So if you all are not familiar, co-working spaces are places where entrepreneurs kind of gather and work together. Typically, entrepreneurs are working on their own thing by themselves or with a very small group of people. And so, if you can imagine a co-working space, and actually we have one at TechTown, is where you can work kind of alone, but together. And these spaces are usually open concept spaces where people can sit down. They might have a dedicated desk, or they might be in kind of a hoteling space where they're in that space for the day. And usually what happens in these spaces is that you might meet your next business partner. You might meet your next funder. People are there not just to work, but also to connect with other folks who have an entrepreneurial drive or who have, some kind of ideas that they're working on. And the strength of the space is based on the kind of dynamic of accidental collisions and creativity that happens. And so part of what was really important to me was, how do you make those spaces as inclusive as possible? Because that adds to the dynamism. So that was one of the things. Conferences are also important from an entrepreneurial community standpoint. So my dissertation was on the sociocultural aspects of entrepreneurial communities, high growth entrepreneurial communities specifically. And so, places like co-working spaces and conferences, tech conferences specifically, are places where people can build social capital, places where people can try out what I would call, and as an anthropologist, I absolutely believe this, the central ritual of entrepreneurship is pitching. So pitching is like, if you ever seen Shark Tank, it's just this thing where in many ways what I'm doing is a pitch, right? It's a PowerPoint presentation. Usually it doesn't always have to be, but you're standing in front of a crowd and you're talking to people about your ideas. And in that conversation, you're creating in their mind the success that you're building. You're creating in their mind the way that you're going to be changing the world. In many ways, it's almost a magical thing. So, in these co-working spaces, in these conferences, these are the types of, and in programs, accelerators, incubators, these are the types of places that are tech spaces. And those places, the level to which inclusion exists really is what kind of bubbles up through the more traditional entrepreneurial networks. This is what bubbles up, what could be called inclusive innovation, what could be called a more inclusive space. And so there are some specific areas where that happens. And so one place that I looked at was Emerge Americas, which is one of the largest conferences for folks who are connected to Latin America, Latinx and Hispanic folks in Miami. Also Digital Undivided, which is a set of entrepreneurial programming for Black and Brown women tech founders. That's in Atlanta, and they also have other programming in other places. And so, I picked out these places who are doing it well, and I found there were some specific principles by which they operated that I found to be in common. At this point, I want to just pause and find out if anybody had any questions about kind of the way that I was gathering data, or any questions at all about what my intent was or anything. Okay. Hearing none, I'm going to keep going.
So Marlo, maybe I can just ask a very quick question.
Sure.
So you were talking about the co-working spaces as being something that is important for inclusion, right? Oftentimes for underrepresented communities, getting access to a co-working space becomes a problem because financial barriers, right? Can you speak about that and how that can be a challenge and how that can be, I guess, remedied in some way?
Sure. So what I found was, I think that it would take a deeper dive into the individual story of the entrepreneur that didn't make it into the spaces that I was talking about in order to get to that. I do believe that there are, in some of the spaces that I went to, you have to pay to get in, but there's a kind of a looser policy around it. It's not a situation like a subway thing where you gotta, click this and then get in. People, and I'm also kind of speaking anecdotally from my experience of being at TechTown too. I mean, people will come in and it's really okay for you to sit there. You might take a day or so and just kind of hang out, especially if you're meeting somebody else. And that's absolutely fine. What I notice is more of what I notice as being more of a barrier is the lack of a welcome for particularly Black folks in tech spaces where there's not a clear majority of Black folks there. We have to be welcome into a space. It's not, and particularly when you get older, but also just generally speaking, in order to feel safe, there has to be kind of this outreach. There's not a presumption that you should be in the space, that you'd be welcome in the space, and that you'd be safe in the space. So part of that is, kind of activating the space. And actually that goes really well into one of the first principles that I found around community organizing. So
Marlo, may I interrupt for a second?
Please.
Dr. Julie Swissler-Wallach had a question. I mean, maybe I can ask her to unmute and ask her question if she's
Sure.
okay with it. Yeah.
I'm here. Sorry.
Mhm.
Hello. I just was curious. I know there's lots of data, especially in urban spaces, about like food deserts or other types of, when you compare urban areas to suburban to rural areas. And I wondered if the same was true about sort of co-working spaces, if anyone had done sort of a geographic analysis of those types of spaces.
I would say that it is more likely the case that there would be deserts if you had a standard sense of what should be in the space. There should be X number of grocery stores for this number of people. I would also just kind of go a little bit anecdotal and say that one of the things that we were really geared up to do at TechTown was to move out into the community. So what is the case is, on the small business services side, and the way that we kind of right now bifurcate ourselves is there's a tech side of the house at TechTown, and then there's a small business services, which is kind of non-tech. We're probably going to be taking 2021 to merge those closer together, because one big takeaway from COVID is that you have to have some kind of technology platform or technology enablement in order to be a viable business going forward. That's just fact. We knew it, but we excused it beforehand, before times. But now we're very clear that in order to be a viable business, there has to be some kind of technology. And so all of our program is actually starting to merge. But that being said, beforehand, our small business services had partnered with community organizations and actually rented space in community spaces and had done business in that way. That's not the same as co-working, and there's a few co-working in Detroit, but we have to redefine that because of a couple of things. We find that because of the way school is working now, we need places that have broadband access. Unfortunately, Detroit is the least connected metro area in the US. And when I say least connected, like the broadband adoption is at the lowest level. It's not the same thing as broadband availability, it's broadband adoption. So part of what is, I'm going to try not to go too far down this, but I really feel quite passionately about this. Part of what co-working space can provide is some connection to the connecting that digital divide. And I think that's a really major piece. Especially we did a couple of interviews for a position that we're hiring at TechTown, and there is a difference between somebody who's able to interview in a space that has great internet access and somebody who's kind of working it from their phone and trying to figure all that stuff out. So I think you've actually piqued my interest around what could be interesting research around that too, like what could be a standard for co-working space, or certainly some form of viable internet access. So
Thank you.
No problem. So community organizing, like creating this sense of community, is really, really important. Entrepreneurs are rarely completely understood by the people that are in their immediate circle, unless they're in business with them. Most of the time they're not. Also, a lot of people in their immediate circle are negatively impacted by entrepreneurial pursuits if you're in a business that's not doing as well. Imagine being the spouse of someone who has a startup, but who's not contributing financially as much as you might be. So there's this isolation that happens that being different can kind of exacerbate. So this idea of creating a strong sense of community and building a greater purpose was something that I certainly saw in my tour of all these spaces. Another thing that I saw was what I would call cultural signifying. It makes a huge difference to see yourself on the wall, to see the books that you read, the music that you listen to, all the things that signify you as a way of explicitly welcoming you. So if somebody, if you go, let's say downtown to the Madison building, there's a certain aesthetic around the Madison building that can be really, really cool, but it's not necessarily specific to the community. At least it wasn't when I used to work out of there. It was specific to, it attracted who actually got there. Whereas when I went to Digital Undivided, which is a picture from this one, they had Oprah wallpaper. They had clocks from, Detroit, Compton, different Chicago, different neighborhoods that people could recognize. And so having this cultural signifying with artifacts and with, kind of a vibe that makes the welcome real was extremely important. I would also, this part was a unexpected finding, but one that resonated well with me. So I'm talking here about, when I talk here about a trauma-informed approach, what I'm saying is that many entrepreneurs, and I've talked to lots and lots of them, particularly for underrepresented people, but this is the same all the way through, but this is particularly for underrepresented people in tech. There are both microaggressions and actual outright aggressions that happen to people. Women, there is something about being in this space that can be really tribalized, that if you're not part of the in-group, you can undertake, you can undergo a lot, right? And so recognizing that some people in their entrepreneurial journey have perhaps encountered trauma, and that informs why they're so triggered if you don't approach them in a way that really, really respects their journey, really, really respects their intelligence, really, really respects their hustle and their drive. I've been in those spaces. I've been on the other side of the table of that. And it's really interesting, the different types of personalities that come in. If you've ever watched, how many of you have watched Shark Tank? I'm just curious.
I have.
Yeah, if you have people who are successful in their journey, sometimes they think that everybody can be successful because they were successful. They think that everybody's experience is the same because, like, oh, I made it, so therefore everybody can make it. Whereas they might not have nearly the amount of obstacles to climb. And so there's, sometimes this dynamic of where people are not respected as people, respected as entrepreneurs, and just recognizing that for people who are doing a really, really great job, they recognize that that trauma might exist, that trauma might be really, really present for the entrepreneurs that you're sitting in front of, and just being very careful about who you're dealing with and the way that you work with them. And I would also say that one of the things I'm really, really proud of, we started something called Start Studio, which is the only program in the city of Detroit that is focused on idea stage tech founders. Usually, if you want to get some kind of assistance around tech, there's got to be a lot more development and maybe a prototype or something like that. And that's where you get some help. But what we do is we help people through what we call a customer discovery process, which is basically doing a lot of interviews with potential customers to find out if what they're doing is something that people will actually want to buy. And so because I'm an anthropologist and because, Wayne State has a great business and organizational anthropology program, what we did was we pair anthropologists with each of the startups, which is something that we hadn't seen before, but we think works really, really well. And those folks help those founders to ask questions in a way that allows them to be more objective, that maybe takes some of the emotion of it out, and helps them ultimately to save a lot of money, because most people come in like, oh, this idea is so perfect. This is exactly what I want to do. And, any data that comes in that says something different can sometimes be very personally, feel like a personal affront. So basically, we're teaching them to be scientists and look at this as data, not personal attack. And this is really, really helpful to help them get the information without it being, and hopefully save money, save time, and also get the skill, because we don't think they're going to have an anthropologist with them all the way through. So the job of the anthropologist is to teach the founder how to do customer discovery in a way that they're scientifically, gathering data, making hypotheses, and continue to move on. So all these things, by the way, that I'm talking about here are things that we've taken and put into the programming at TechTown and made sure it was something that we made real. So there's that, but there's also allowing people to be themselves and their authentic self, not being the other. So with Start Studio, I'm really, really proud of, there's a lot of gender and racial and ethnic diversity, but we've had people who are in their 70s, people who are, just young students, people who have a whole lot of different kind of experiences. And so it's, in a lot of these spaces, you see kind of Zuckerberg clones where you have to have this kind of thing going on where, if you're retired and you're an engineer and you're just trying to figure out, how to do something that's different, this is a space that you can be in and feel really, really comfortable. Part of what that is relevant representation. And so I really love this quote when they talk about how tech is not looking for inclusion, they're looking for assimilation. So what's important to get is when you're designing inclusive spaces that you not only introduce and allow people to be in there but that they are able to be themselves in the space. So if you're recruiting somebody who's different from what tech usually has to offer, it's important that they're different in a way that's authentic to them and they can be that. They have the permission to be who they are in the space. That's, extra, extra, extra important. Because if you don't, then, that inauthenticity is something that's going to shine through all the way through, all the time, right? And so when you think about how you allow people to dress or how you, create spaces for them, that stuff is just, really, really important. Another thing that, the last kind of takeaway that I'll talk about in terms of that research is that there is a linear way that many people think about in terms of equity that might not be the case. And when I say this, what I really mean is that I think traditionally people think that people who are the other, racialized people, if you're Black, if you're Hispanic, or even people who are just other, generally speaking, the thought is what they want is to be equal. And therefore, in order to be equal, there's a certain path to get there. And one of the things that, I would like you to consider based on some of the research that I've got is that it's not necessarily the case that everybody's looking to replicate the traditional path. And in fact, there is, Derek Bell is a really wonderful, or was a really wonderful scholar. And one of the ideas that he brought out was the idea of the permanence of racism. Like the idea is not necessarily to eradicate racism because it cannot be eradicated. Like we're not trying to eliminate racism. We're not trying to create equality because it is not possible. Therefore, what can you create? What kind of future can you create given that you don't, you're not shooting for that particular path? And also, what can you claim for yourself when you're not doing the emotional, the spiritual, the psychological labor that's involved in trying to create an equal state that is not possible? And so then you start looking at, okay, how are people creating different spaces? So one of the things, there's an organization called Zebras Unite, and what it's about is it's anti-unicorn. Even though unicorn is my, the 5 unicorns is my goal, the idea is, instead of trying to be a unicorn and disrupt and do all these wonderful Facebooky type things, how do we create a new possibility for what success looks like in tech? And unicorns are, much more realistic than zebras are much more realistic than unicorns. They're called a dazzle. I don't know if you all knew that a group of unicorns was called a dazzle. That's kind of cool. But just this idea that instead of trying to chase a traditional space, and almost break yourself in the process, how do we create new spaces and take care of self in doing that? And so really that was, those kind of takeaways that I got from that research. I think that in terms of how to support tech founders, how to create tech spaces that, in terms of how to support tech founders, is really about creating those spaces. It's about taking the things that we talked about and actually creating the work. And you can substitute tech for whatever verb, if it's academic spaces or whatever spaces it is, I really wanted to focus in my research around, okay, this is wonderful, these things that we found, but what does it mean in terms of what we actually do? And so, because I do a lot of work around diversity, inclusion, equity, what I found was this framework of first assessing the current state, seeing what's actually there, creating safety. And when I say safety, there's a book, I don't know if any of you've heard of it, called Crucial Conversations. It's a fantastic book that I would highly recommend. One of the biggest takeaways for it is that if you create enough safety, any conversation is possible, right? So if you ever find yourself in any situation talking about stuff that you didn't think you were going to talk about, it's because somebody made it safe for you to do so. So part of that, creating these inclusive spaces is actually creating enough safety, enough psychological and even physical safety to be able to talk about what needs to be talked about. There have been times where I've been in conversations or calls where there are things weighing on my mind. I'm dealing with some kind of inequitable situation. And because I might be interested in keeping my job, I can't have a conversation about it. Because my colleague might be worried about offending me, that person can't have a conversation about it. And so there is a way to create safety in the moment by exploring commonality, by even stating that what we're trying to do is create a safe enough space to get to a common goal. Those kinds of things are really, really important in terms of creating inclusive spaces. And then communicating widely, making sure that there is an organizational emphasis around creating inclusive spaces, and that is not something that is designated and relegated to a few. And last, really thinking about implementation in terms of accountability. So, I'm sure as we've talked about what's happening in terms of our conversations around race, and the reckoning that we've had as a result of that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. There's a lot of statements, a lot of communication about where people are. But there's real implication around implementation. What are you actually going to do, and how are we going to be made accountable to do it? And so that's where much of where the rubber meets the road. And here's where I'll pause for a second, because then now I'm going to kind of transition into the rubber meeting the road, into what's been happening with us. But I saw there were a couple of chat things. Bujo, did you see? I can't see it.
Right. I think Chris is talking about what Julie asked a little bit ago. But Chris, did you want to say something about it?
No, I was trying to answer Julie's chat.
Okay. So I think Julie asked it a little bit ago, and we had the same conversation.
I didn't realize it was that long ago.
Actually, I'd like to ask something.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'd be interested to hear one or two examples of TechTown successes.
General successes or success?
Yes, specific. I'd like to hear one or two cases where TechTown succeeded in helping an entrepreneur get something off the ground.
So let me talk a little bit about a company called RaxPlay. RaxPlay is, well, let me tell you how it started. A guy named Isaac Lyman runs RaxPlay. What it is they take music beyond audio. They're a virtual and mixed reality platform for musical artists. So how I connected with them is when I first started as director of technology-based programs. We were running a program called DTX, which was for students and student-based and recent grads. It's an accelerator. We paid students over the summer to work on their businesses. So Isaac was part of one group called Rax Artists. There was some other folks that were part of another group. And as what happens sometimes with these students, people fell off, and each of their partners fell off, and the two of them combined together and became Rax Play, and they became a company. And we were really excited about that company, and they ended up in their final pitch winning the entire competition. They won, I think the biggest prize at that point, I don't know how we had this much money at that point, but it was $10,000. So they won $10,000. And Isaac himself, he's so enthusiastic. He won also People's Choice Award because he's like that guy that's always grinding. And at the end of that summer, this was 2019, every day afterwards, we saw him. And by the way, usually with these kinds of programs, you go, and certainly before I got there, we were recruiting at Michigan State, University of Michigan, Northern Michigan, et cetera. He was a student from Washtenaw Community College. And so it was it was so cool for him to win representing a community college. But then after that, we saw his hustle. And so every day he would be at TechTown. And it turns out one of the other prizes for DTX was that you got co-working space there for, I believe we put in 6 months or a year or something like that. As a result of, kind of doing the work, he found out about the Bose hackathon. So Bose are speakers. They had Bose glasses that integrates the speakers into the glasses. So he participated in the hackathon, and they didn't win first place, but they placed in there. They also won a spot in the new at the time, Motown accelerator in connection with G Beta. So they got a spot in that. And since then, he's gotten a lot of traction for something that I think is going to be, I told him when I first met him, I was like, this is either going to be really, really big or, not much happened, but I think it's something really, really big is going to happen. He recently, like 2 weeks ago, was one of the companies that was awarded in the Google Black Founders funding events. He was awarded $50,000. And at this point, he's at a place, the partner, the one that was in DTX with him, he's on the West Coast. And they're at a point right now of going beyond kind of pilots and about to launch this bigger augmented reality platform for music and musicians. Because basically the problem with their song is that streaming services only give musicians pennies on, per stream. And so with a more augmented or virtual reality experience of the music, they can upcharge on the experience and ultimately make more money as artists. So I'd say that we were helpful with them in that, we are connected with that Motown accelerator, though we didn't necessarily allow them, give them that slot. Just the fact that we were there helped. We obviously helped in terms of the DTX connection in the first place. And also just since that time, he's gotten some additional opportunities for funding and mentors and things like that. That's one story. I'm not going to tell a whole lot of different stories, but we're really personally invested with a lot of the folks that go through our programs. So I'll stop with that one. Here's the thing though, we need a lot more big stories. I will tell you the one that got away. Delane Parnell is a young entrepreneur. I don't think he's 30 yet. Young entrepreneur from Detroit. Really hustled, was part of this ecosystem. Also, as a young kid, had a couple of mobile phone store, so he was really entrepreneurially motivated. He ended up going to the Bay. He started a company called Play Versus. It is now the platform for esports for high schools nationally. He raised, I think, the second most amount of money in a Series A. Young Black kid, he's not 30 yet. I think his company, he's raised, I believe at this time, maybe $90 million or so. But he is poised, he's connected with what is the NCAA for high school. And he's going to be the infrastructure for doing, right now, esports, there are colleges that recruit kids for sports. And esports is one of those sports that you can actually get a scholarship and go to college for. And so his company is creating the infrastructure that makes that work. And I would love to be able to have enough of a place so that we could have accommodated that here. Because the guy that invested in him said, you can stay in Detroit and be a millionaire, or you can go to Silicon Valley and be a billionaire. You choose. And he chose. And he comes back and visits and does a lot of speaking, but Delane Parnell is his name. It just has a really fascinating story. I just remember, sitting next to him and seeing his grind, and I would just love to be able to reach more kids like him, and also be able to have enough of an infrastructure here so that we can have those kind of success stories. Any other questions?
Phil, did you have a follow-up to that, or did that make sense to you?
No, that was fine. Thank you very much.
Okay, cool. So I'll talk a little bit about Hard Reset. I think that we are going through a couple of crises at the same time. A crisis around this pandemic and a crisis around a racial reckoning that has been a long time coming. That's exacerbated by the pandemic, but that sits apart and separate from it. And so one of the things that we recognize is that these crises have made it much more clear that inclusion has to be a part of what we're dealing with as a not just as a country, but as business leaders. Like the people who we kind of saw as being invisible, the folks who are bagging groceries, or the folks who are handling the waste at a hospital. Those folks matter, and also those folks have a lot of the knowledge that you as a business need to be successful. So if you don't care so much about the first, you certainly need to care about the second. The fact that a lot of this knowledge, it is definitely the case that our perspective has changed. And so myself and the young lady named Marlon Williams, who I work with a lot, she's the global vice president she's the vice president of global diversity and inclusion at StockX. StockX is it's a unicorn company, a startup started by Dan Gilbert. That's like a stock market for shoes, like limited edition shoes and other kinds of commodities that are out there. And it's a global company. And actually that's another kind of case for inclusion. Like I'm not a sneakerhead, and I understand like the whole business model behind that. I didn't understand Twitter's business model until, a few years after it came out either. So just understanding that there's these different problems and problem states, and that can be a source of inclusion and certainly a source of wealth generation is really, really important. And so let me tell you a really, really quick story about two different jobs, okay? And these are my jobs, the jobs that I had. And the first one was one that I did work around entrepreneurship, but it was in a very non-diverse environment. environment that that I would consider to be aggressively non-diverse. Like they were really, really non-diverse. And in that environment, there were very few people who were into entrepreneurship. And so, you know, that to me was kind of the basis of my value as an employee. I came there as somebody specifically dealing with entrepreneurship, and also somebody specifically different from all the people that are around me. And there were times that I certainly I felt disengaged from the organization. And there were even times that I felt physically not that safe. Despite the fact that I wasn't in any real, I don't think I was in really any real danger, but it just felt unsafe. And so that was kind of one situation. And then there was another job experience that I had where entrepreneurship was the focus and the foundation of what that organization does. And the inclusion part of entrepreneurship was what it considered to be its advantage. And the organization itself is inclusive, not just diverse, but inclusive, and then also it's inside a community that is inclusive. And there's a real shared understanding of what's important, what's, you know, what is a priority. There's a shared sense of the vision. And so I'm going to stop right now and ask each one of you who feels like responding to me, if I'm not going to ask you about where you are right now, but I'll ask you, how many of you have ever been in a situation that is more like number one? Just real quick, just give me make a little digital hand. Okay. Great. So I'm really happy that so many of you have never been in the number one situation, because it's not that fun. So how many of you have been in the number two situation? That is a much better place to be. And so if you think about it, when you feel unheard or you feel psychologically unsafe, you are in survival mode. And when you feel like you belong, you can actually perform. And the overall environment can enhance and multiply this effect. So if you have people who are already feeling like they're in survival mode, feeling already unsafe, when a crisis hits, they're going to be severely impacted, right? If you're in number one space and COVID hits, then that's just a place of where you can't really get much done, right? And even though it doesn't feel like it, there have been other crises. And when any of these crises hit and you are already in the number one spot, you cannot perform in the way that you should be performing, in the way that they, you know, hired you to perform. And as a leader, it's really, really important to understand that you have people who you might think are in a number two space, but they're actually in a number one space. You know, I remember just confiding with some of the people when I was at that first job that I did not feel safe. And they were so shocked that that was the case. And so it takes having some understanding that there are people who do not feel safe. And that safety, while it's, you know, we can talk about it very obviously in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and all these other things that had always been happening, but now are more clear that they're happening. It's easy to talk about in terms of race, but also as someone who is at, you know, this year was my 50th birthday milestone. And so just recognizing that at that age, there's a different way of relating to your colleagues. Maybe there's a different way of them relating to you. So there's a space of kind of feeling other there too. I don't feel it right now, but I know that that's something that's possible, right? So all these things are places where you might feel like, hey, they don't think I am relevant, or they think I'm obsolete, or, because I'm a white male, I might not be like in right now, I'm feeling obsolete. Whatever it is, if you are in survival mode, if you don't feel like you're included or you belong, then that is going to impact you. And ultimately, like I said, if you're a leader and you're managing people, or you are responsible for getting a certain thing done, then your team's ability to get a particular thing done is going to be impacted. And so I'm going to just talk a little bit about a grid that talks about this, and to help you think about it more clearly. So in the first case, and this is based on some research around inclusion and diversity, you should really think about, you could think about it in two ways, like a high sense of belonging, a low sense of belonging, and a place where uniqueness is valued or sameness is valued. I saw that there was something in the chat. I don't have like a chat box. Is there anything to talk about?
Happy belated birthday.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. I had a COVID Zoom birthday thing. So that was not how I expected to do 50, but it was fun actually.
Thank you, Adrian.
You said what?
Sorry, I'm trying to mute and unmute myself, but Adrian is the person who, wished you
Yes.
happy birthday. So I
Yes.
wanted to thank him.
You, Adrian. I appreciate that. So when there's differentiation, you can be in a place that you're different, but you're uncomfortable being different, right? Where, and that's, honestly, that was where I was in number one. Like the people were nice, and they kind of sometimes appreciated my uniqueness, but I did not feel a sense of belonging. I didn't feel like I belonged there. You can also be in a space where you don't belong, and they don't like who you are. They don't like what you bring. They wish you would kind of get along with the rest of the group. That's exclusion, and that's not a place where anybody can really operate in any good kind of way. Another place to be is when you have this kind of high sense of belonging, but you're really kind of asked to put on a mask. And so when we talk about before relevant representation, we're saying, it is where people are there, but they're asked to be like their other colleagues. They can't be their authentic self. But the gold standard, what we're trying to get to, is where people feel like they can belong and they can be themselves completely. And where we are as a people is, these crises of COVID and a tipping point on race relation is where we are. And basically, there is a lot of trauma that people have gone through this crisis. And also, there is the baggage of trauma that people are bringing into the situation that they're working with too. And bigger than that, there are a lot of people who are like, enough. We really, with all the things politically, with all the things economically, all the things from health, it's too much to take all this in and try to continue to function. So that's what we talk about when we say forcing a hard reset. You really have to at some point stop and do something different. And part of what that difference is facing some very, very uncomfortable truths. There's a really great book called White Fragility that talks about, particularly for white folks, when we talk about race, how it can kind of sometimes be very, very uncomfortable, and people can get to a very, very defensive place very quickly. But there's also fragility around privilege, generally speaking. I'm at a place where I can work from home, and through this crisis, my my bottom line has not changed. And whatever change that happened was actually probably positive in that don't have to drive as much. I don't have to, my summer where I usually am spending thousands of dollars on summer camps and stuff like that, none of that happened. It was Netflix camp all day, every day, with some going out and doing some stuff. So there's this kind of reckoning when we realize that there's these essential people who we depend on, and they are likely the least paid people. And so those are really uncomfortable truths. Another uncomfortable truth is that there are inequities around gender. My husband is a principal. His school is in person. I am expected, because I have a flexible job, I got to take care of kids. I don't know. I think I would just be expected to take care of the kids, even though he's a principal, really great with kids. He's a great father, great husband, all that. But there's this kind of thing of, she's probably going to have it worked out until I don't. So, there's this exodus of women who are leaving the workforce because they're getting hit by the homeschooling and hit by, this, that, and the other. That really is a very uncomfortable thing. You think that we're at a much more equitable state, and we're not. I think that it's also really, really uncomfortable to realize, and I think this was the lesson of 2016, and it continues to be the lesson today, that there are people that who know you, that you like, and it might even be you, who are okay with racism. Like, at a bottom line, that it's not a deal breaker. And I think for some people, there was this, especially underrepresented folks, there was this thought that, okay, we think that racism is bad. We think that all those things are bad, and that if we see any hint of it, it's a bad thing. And what we got to find out is that there is for some significant number of people, it's not a bad enough thing to make a difference or make a change around the way that they vote or the way that they act or any of those other things. And so I'm not talking about anybody's heart, because I don't really care as much about anybody's heart. I'm talking about the way that people actually behaved. And so this is an uncomfortable thing. It's like, you ever seen those slasher movies where, the killer's calling and then they say it's calling from in the house. You kind of didn't realize that was so close to you. But that is the uncomfortable truth that folks didn't really get. But that now it's really clear that's important. And so I think that another important thing to get is that because of the way that we're polarized, because of the way that we communicate, because of the bubbles that we tend to be in, like, you don't do a lot of switching between MSNBC and Fox and back and forward. There are echo chambers that people are in. And there's also kind of social media that allows us to spread things out far and wide. There's this opportunity for spotlights and landmines, right? Whatever you do, whatever you say, it can be spotlighted really easily as a good thing. Like you hear good things about people do, and then you hear about landmines, like things that something that somebody does, one tweet, one retweet, retweet, I can say this, one repost, and it can really have significant implications getting back from a business perspective. Like, it can make you or break you. It can build a career or it can tear one down completely. And so I think it's important as we look at some of these real things to recognize that that's even more the case. Like, just understanding inclusion, understanding the the spaces that you're in is even more important. And as a business leader, that has to be kind of an extra important thing to you. So it's not a nice to have, it's a have to have, because millions, even billions of dollars are at stake if you say or do the thing that that can be immediately spotlighted. And so another thing that's important.
Marlo,
Sure,
just a quick warning. So a lot of folks will have class at 2 o'clock, so we should wrap it up in about another 5 minutes-ish.
I will definitely do that.
Thank you.
So thank you. I appreciate it, because yeah, I appreciate it. So another thing we talk about is data-driven diversity and inclusion. So along with those spotlights and landmarks, people want to see the receipts. They want to, it's like, show me the money, show me the receipts. And I think that it's important as leaders that we go beyond like the basic numbers and interpret the data, tell the story. So as you're thinking about looking at this graph, you don't just say, as scientists, we can say, this is the data and make your own interpretation, right? But there's an opportunity to go beyond that and say, okay, based on that, there's an opportunity here. We can go beyond just presenting the data and actually move us and be more directional. And last, but not least, self-care is important. So if you're in this space, if you're more in a number one than number two, if you're even leading inclusion and doing things that, kind of rock the boat a little bit, it's important to understand that these things do take from you. We talked about critical race theory. Sometimes it's not worth it to necessarily slay the whole dragon, right, at one time. You do have to create space for self-care as you're doing work around radical inclusion, around diversity. And I've particularly found it as I'm in this tech world, I really get passionate about it, but I need to create that space. And I'm challenging each of you, as you're doing this work, you do need to create that space. And so I have a few questions, but before I ask them, I will find out if there's anybody else who have questions.
We're kind of in the home stretch, so folks, if you have a question, please feel free to ask.
So for those of you who deal with this at all, who try to create inclusive spaces in your work, what has, if anything, has been your barrier, your biggest barrier to fostering inclusion? Actually, does anybody do any of that work, either formally or informally?
I'm trying to see if folks want to join in and answer. Lisa, if you want to speak up loud, that would be great.
I had some students mention in my class, I teach lab classes, that I should try to promote and facilitate diverse lab groups. And so I've been trying that informally. So that's all I'm just trying it. And she mentioned that in the spring, and she was referring to Americans versus international students. She thought that, I as the instructor should facilitate that, and I agree with her.
I would absolutely agree too, as many groups that I've been in, I don't want the psychological burden of having to make that connection. And also I think that the things that I've learned from connecting with people that I would have never done, that I would have never kind of stepped and spoken to myself, I've learned a lot in that process. What I'm going to do is just put out all the questions that I had, and anybody can take on any of that. Like, are there any assumptions or blind spots that you've had around this work? And also, I'm just curious, you don't have to be at all formally doing this, but I just wonder if you're in a workplace that has a more liberal leaning culture, is it a place where conservatives can feel included? And if you are in a more conservative culture, can liberals feel included? Sometimes when there's that strong culture, you know, it sucks out all the space for anybody that thinks differently. And you can't be yourself. So even if you held more conservative views, you know, I don't believe that people should, anybody should have to be inauthentic. I do believe though that nobody's behavior should be impeding in any way on anybody else's behavior. And the last question I have is around, what are you not being honest about in your workplace? And for us, even though we at TechTown are we're really focused on inclusion, our leadership and our staff does not reflect our city. And this is something that I think has been something that people have lived with, like the leadership at many of the places that provide capital in the city of Detroit don't reflect the composition of the city. And I think people are okay with that. Isn't like just because it's always been. And I think that there's some opportunity to switch it up a little bit.
There's a lot going on here.
Yeah, there's a lot of work.
No, it's good. I think, one of the things that I think, and it kind of touches on a bunch of these different things, like the barrier that I feel, one of the biggest barriers, that I feel to fostering inclusion is just like you said, that sort of sense of being uncomfortable, finding out how different people perceive things. And so I think that at least in our sort of department culture, then we've tended to just, I don't know if ignores the right word, but just try not to talk, you know what I mean? Like we try not to focus on that. And I do think that's sort of a form of dishonesty. And I think the other big thing I know that I struggle with, and I'm sure lots of the other instructors do as well, is trying to figure out, we deal with students who come from a broad diversity of backgrounds, and I do believe that there's value in that, but also trying to then get a handle on how do you, try to level that playing field when you're dealing with potentially 18 prior years of inequity, and what is possible in a short term to try and account for that and compensate for that, or what's a good idea. And I don't think anyone has a magic bullet, but trying to think through those things and what are the things that should be done versus would foster that sense of too much differentiation, right? And it's all kind of rolled into that process. But those are just my thoughts.
Yeah, great and interesting thoughts. I think, some of us struggle with a lot of that. Like there's a lot to do. One thing I would point you to is a self-care piece. Like it's
That'd probably
important.
be good.
Yeah, that's just important. But also just taking a bit of it at a time. I think small wins are really, creating very small wins are really, really important. For me, when I was at that number one place, it was in what was called a sundown town. Well, it was in a place that, like I said, I never felt, though I felt sometimes physically unsafe, I never was. I always had people who treated me pretty well. I just didn't always feel like I belonged. And so I will let you know that the city that I was working in was Howell, Michigan. I don't know if y'all have ever heard of it, but it has.
Oh yes, I'm a native Michigander. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Okay. So my small win, I had a couple of small wins, but one of them was there's a movie called The 13th, which is produced by Ava DuVernay. If you all ever have a chance to look at it, please do. It's around mass incarceration.
It's on my watch list.
Okay, wonderful. So I, as part of my role, I was able to help produce an event where we showed The 13th at the theater downtown in Howell. which and then have a conversation nearby about it. And it was really with a panel of folks from inside house, from definitely in the local area. And it was a transformational experience for me. Now, you know, there was a lot of opportunity to do stuff to make change there. And I didn't get to nearly all of it. But that was just one thing. I was like, okay, that, and also kind of diversifying the board of the organization that I work for. Those two things were kind of the things that I worked on. Like I said, there's a lot of other things I could have, if I wanted to spend the next 20 years of my life, I could have done. But you know, those were small victories that I hold on to.
No, I think that's a good idea. You know, there are lots of things you can't change.
Right.
And you don't want to go horse shouting into the wind, but yeah.
Right. But
Yep.
there are small things you can do. And so, you know, doing those things that's a very good feeling.
So since we are kind of at a stopping point, it's 1:55, so we have 5 minutes left in the session, and a lot of people have classes at 2 o'clock. So I would say I'm going to stop recording here, but feel free to hang around, and if you feel, you know, feel free to leave, but feel free to hang around, and, you know, if you want to talk to Dr. Rencher, if she's available for a little bit longer, that's fine. And I'm going to stop recording.